Sarah Okonkwo stepped off the transport shuttle and into the massive docking bay of Kelvin Station with her equipment, bags slung over one shoulder, and a sense of excitement warming her chest after 3 weeks of travel through jump gates and transfer points. The station hung in orbit around a purple gas giant and served as neutral ground where dozens of species gathered for diplomatic functions and scientific conferences. And right now, Sarah was here for the annual Xenobiology Symposium, where researchers from across the galaxy would share their findings about alien ecosystems and life forms. She checked her datapad and noted that her presentation on Earth, Predator Social Structures, wasn't scheduled until day 3, which gave her plenty of time to explore the station and attend the other talks, and maybe even visit the famous biodomes that Kelvin Station maintained as living exhibits of various planetary environments. A mechanical voice announced through the station speakers that all new arrivals should report to the Orientation Center for safety briefings, and Sarah followed the illuminated pathway along the curved corridor where she passed traders and diplomats and scientists of every imaginable shape and size. The orientation lasted an hour and covered emergency procedures and cultural sensitivity guidelines and restricted areas, and Sarah paid attention, even though much of it was standard protocol she had heard on a dozen other stations when the briefing ended. A perky Dalthonian guide with 6 arms and bioluminescent spots invited the newcomers to join an optional tour of the biodomes, and Sarah immediately signed up because she never passed up a chance to see alien wildlife up close. The group of 15 visitors followed their guide through the residential sectors and past the commercial districts until they reached a massive transparent tunnel that connected the main station to the biodome complex, which floated like a giant soap bubble. Attached to the station's outer ring inside the first dome, Sarah gasped at the recreation of a Uralin swamp, complete with the humid air and the smell of rotting vegetation and the distant calls of creatures hidden in the purple-tinted mists. Guide explained that each biodome was maintained at significant expense to provide both research opportunities and to help diplomats feel more comfortable by offering glimpses of home worlds. They moved through 3 more domes, and Sarah took notes and photos and asked questions that made the guide spots glow brighter with enthusiasm. Then they entered the 5th dome, which housed a Bulgarian mountain environment, and the temperature dropped immediately and the air thinned just enough to notice, and Sarah saw artificial peaks rising into manufactured clouds. The Vicarian ambassador personally funded this biodome, the guide announced, and gestured toward the rocky landscape with 2 of her arms, and even imported breeding pairs of several species from the home world, including the magnificent Vicarian mountain stalkers, which are apex predators. That an alarm shrieked through the dome, and red lights began pulsing along the walls, and the guide spots flickered from blue to alarmed yellow. "Please remain calm," a station voice announced. "There has been a containment breach in Biodome 5, and all visitors must evacuate immediately through the emergency exits." The guide's translator struggled to keep up as she spoke rapidly and gestured frantically toward a door that had opened in the curved wall. But half the group panicked and ran in different directions, and in the chaos, Sarah found herself separated from the main group. As people shoved past her, she stumbled backward off the main path and into a cluster of artificial boulders, and by the time she regained her balance, the other visitors had disappeared through various exits, and the alarm continued its piercing wail. Sarah pulled out her datapad to check the dome map, but the device showed only static, and she realized the emergency protocols had shut down non-essential systems. She decided to follow the curve of the wall until she found an exit and started walking carefully between the rocks while keeping one hand on the cold stone to steady herself on the uneven terrain. Sound made her freeze. It came from behind a large boulder and sounded like a whimper mixed with a growl, and Sarah's xenobiology training kicked in as she analyzed the vocalization and recognized it as a juvenile distress call. She moved slowly around the boulder and found 3 creatures huddled against the rock face. They were Vecarian cubs, each about the size of a large dog, with thick silvery fur and oversized paws, and small horns just beginning to emerge from their skulls, and their eyes were wide with fear. Sarah knew that Vecarian mountain stalkers were dangerous, and that adults stood over 2 meters tall and could bite through steel, but these were babies, and they were clearly terrified by the alarms and the flashing lights. She also knew that running would trigger their chase instinct, and that sudden movements would be interpreted as aggression. So she sat down. She simply lowered herself to the ground, about 3 meters away from the cubs, and crossed her legs and rested her hands in her lap and waited. Cubs watched her with those enormous eyes, and their ears swiveled toward her, and then back toward the alarm sound. Sarah began humming softly, and not any particular song, but just a low, gentle sound that her grandmother had used to calm skittish animals back on the family farm in Nigeria. One cub took a hesitant step toward her, and then another step, and its siblings watched nervously. Sarah kept humming and kept her body relaxed and unthreatening. First cub reached her and sniffed her knee, and then her hand and its whiskers tickled her skin, and she slowly turned her palm upward in an offering gesture. The cub pushed its broad head into her palm, and she felt the warmth of its breath and the surprising softness of its furs. Other 2 cubs tumbled forward then and clustered around her, and one climbed partially into her lap while the third pressed against her side, and they made small chirping sounds that Sarah recognized as comfort vocalizations. She stroked their fur gently and continued humming, and the cubs gradually relaxed and their breathing slowed, and eventually they curled up around her and fell asleep. Sarah sat there surrounded by sleeping predators and wondered how security would react when they found her, but she didn't dare move and risk waking them and sending them into another panic. An hour passed according to her chronometer, and her legs went numb and her back ached, but the cubs slept peacefully. Finally, she heard voices and the sound of boots on stone and a security team in full combat. Armor rounded the boulder with weapons raised. The team leader stopped so suddenly that the officer behind him collided with his back. "Don't move," the team leader said unnecessarily, because Sarah had no intention of moving. "I'm not controlling them," Sarah said quietly, "and I didn't call them to me." "Then what are they doing?" the team leader asked, and his weapon remained pointed in her general direction. "Sleeping," Sarah replied. "We can see that," the team leader said, and his tone suggested he didn't appreciate her stating the obvious. "But why are they sleeping on you and not trying to tear you apart like they did to the maintenance droid that accidentally released them?" Sarah looked down at the cubs and felt one shift in its sleep and pressed closer to her warmth. "They chose to trust me," she said, and knew how inadequate that sounded. As an explanation, the security team called for the Vecarian ambassador, and for animal handlers, and for medical personnel, and Sarah sat there for another 30 minutes while various officials arrived and stared and argued about the best way to proceed. Finally, the ambassador herself appeared, and the tall, dignified Vecarian female took one look at the scene, and her facial plates shifted into what Sarah recognized as extreme confusion. "How did you bond with them?" the ambassador demanded. "What technology are you using, and what gives you the right to touch cubs of my species?" "I'm not using technology," Sarah protested. "And I didn't bond with them, and they came to me, and I just stayed calm and they felt safe." "Impossible," the ambassador said flatly. "Vecarian cubs imprint on their mothers through specific pheromone signatures, and they attack anything else, and you are clearly not Vecarian, and yet they treat you as family." The ambassador stepped closer, and the cubs woke at the sound of her voice, and they should have run to her, but instead they pressed closer to Sarah and made small defensive growls. The ambassador's plates shifted again into an expression Sarah couldn't read. "Security will take you into custody," the ambassador announced, "until we determine what illegal methods you employed to manipulate these cubs." Sarah wanted to argue, but 3 guards moved forward and carefully extracted the protesting cubs from her lap, and she stood on shaky legs and allowed herself to be escorted away while the cubs cried out behind her, and she felt her heart break at their distress. She didn't call them, and she didn't manipulate them, and she had no idea why they had chosen her. But as the security guards led her toward the detention center, Sarah knew that her simple explanation would never satisfy the authorities, who demanded to understand what had happened in that dome. Commander Zilfvar reviewed the security footage for the 7th time and still could not reconcile what his sensors told him with what his experience suggested was possible. The human sat motionless for 63 standard minutes, while 3 Vicarian cubs that had just mauled a maintenance droid slept peacefully in her lap, and the thermal imaging showed no unusual energy signatures, and the chemical sensors detected no foreign pheromones, and the electromagnetic scanners found no evidence of neuromanipulation technology. Yet the cubs had clearly been influenced somehow. Zilfvar was a Krelian, and his species had spent millennia perfecting security protocols and investigation techniques, and in his 40 years of service, he had uncovered smuggling operations and espionage networks, and even a plot to assassinate the High Council, and he prided himself on his ability to find the truth, no matter how well hidden. He opened Dr. Sarah Okonkwo's personnel file and began reading through her history. Born on Earth in the Nigerian region and raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a transport accident, and educated at multiple institutions before specializing in xenobiology and predator behavior, and her academic record was impressive, with dozens of published papers and teaching positions at 3 universities. But what caught Zilfvar's attention was a series of incident reports attached to her file 6 years ago on Theros Prime. Local authorities filed a report after Sarah was found surrounded by a pack of juvenile thornbacks, which were territorial predators that attacked anything that entered their den areas, and yet they had apparently adopted Sarah during her research expedition and followed her for 3 days 4 years ago on Galax. Station security investigated after the station administrator's imported guard beast abandoned its post and refused to leave Sarah's quarters, where it had somehow gained entry while she slept, and the creature had to be tranquilized and removed. 3 years ago on Mundari, the 7th, she was briefly detained when a group of hatchlings from an endangered species broke through their sanctuary barriers and tracked her to her hotel, and the sanctuary officials accused her of using illegal attractant chemicals. But testing found nothing. The pattern continued through 2 more planets, and each time authorities investigated and found no evidence of technology or chemicals or any method of manipulation, and each time the incidents were dismissed as remarkable coincidences. But Zilfvar did not believe in coincidences. Scheduled an interrogation session and had Dr. Okonkwo brought from her detention cell to interview room 3, which was equipped with the most sophisticated truth verification equipment in the station. Sarah entered the room escorted by 2 guards, and she looked tired but composed, and she sat in the chair across from Zilfvar without being instructed to do so. "Do you know why you're here?" Zilfvar asked, and activated the recording systems. "Because you think I did something to those cubs," Sarah replied, and met his gaze steadily. "Did you?" Zilfvar asked. "No," Sarah said simply. The truth verification equipment remained green. "Then explain what happened," Zilfvar said, and leaned forward. Sarah took a breath and began speaking, and she described finding the cubs and sitting down and humming, and how they had approached her, and Zilfvar listened and watched the verification equipment, and everything she said registered as truth, as she believed it. "Have you had similar experiences with other species?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah admitted, "but I don't understand why it happens." "Tell me about your childhood," Zilfvar said, and changed direction. Sarah seemed surprised by the question, but complied, and she talked about growing up with her grandmother, who kept goats and chickens and dogs, and how her grandmother taught her to approach animals with patience and respect. My grandmother always said that you can't make an animal trust you, Sarah explained, and you can only show them that you're safe, and then they decide for themselves. And you apply this philosophy to alien predators? Zilfvar asked skeptically. I don't really apply anything, Sarah said, and frustration crept into her voice. It just happens, and I'm being honest when I say, I don't know why. Zilfvar stood and paced around the room while considering his options. I'm ordering a full medical scan, he announced, and we'll test for any biological anomalies or hidden implants, and we'll analyze your pheromone production and your neural patterns. Sarah nodded wearily. I've been through this before, and you won't find anything. She was correct. 3 days of intensive testing revealed that Dr. Sarah Okonkwo was a completely normal human female with no augmentations or modifications or unusual biological markers, and her pheromone signature was unremarkable, and her neural activity was within expected parameters for her species. Zilfvar reviewed the results with growing frustration, and his tail lashed in agitation. The Bulgarian ambassador demanded answers, and the station administrator wanted the situation resolved, and the scientific community was buzzing with theories and speculation, and yet Zilfvar had nothing concrete to report. He decided to take a more direct approach. He arranged for a controlled experiment. If Dr. Okonkwo could truly influence predatory species without technology, then she should be able to demonstrate this ability under laboratory conditions, and if she could not, then he would know she had simply been extraordinarily lucky. He selected the most dangerous species available in the station's research facilities, which were Krath hatchlings. Krath were a species that had terrorized 3 star systems before being contained through military action, and they were obligate carnivores with crystalline spines that could pierce armor and pack hunting instincts that made them devastatingly effective killers. And adults stood 3 meters tall and could take down prey 10 times their size. Hatchlings were smaller but no less dangerous, and in 200 years of study, no species had successfully domesticated or even peacefully coexisted with Krath, and they killed on instinct. Zilfvar informed Dr. Okonkwo of the experiment and watched her reaction carefully. You want to put me in a room with Krath hatchlings? She asked, and her voice remained steady but her pupils dilated with fear. If you can influence them as you claim, then you have nothing to fear, Zilfvar said. I never claimed I could influence anything, Sarah protested, and I just said that some young animals choose to trust me. Then this is your opportunity to prove it, Zilfvar said, or to admit that you've been using illegal technology. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and then she squared her shoulders. Fine, she said, but I want the experiment recorded, and I want medical personnel standing by, and I want your promise that if I survive and the hatchlings do choose to trust me, that you'll release me. Zilfvar considered her terms and nodded. Agreed, he said. The experiment was scheduled for 3 days later, which gave time to prepare the arena and arrange for observers and brief the medical teams. News of the test spread through the station like fire, and suddenly everyone wanted to attend, and Zilfvar had to limit the observation deck to essential personnel and scientific advisors. The night before the experiment, Sarah lay in her detention cell and thought about her grandmother. The old woman had taught her so much about patience and respect and the importance of letting animals make their own choices, and Sarah wondered if those lessons would be enough to keep her alive tomorrow. She thought about the cubs on the station and hoped they were being cared for properly. And she thought about all the other young creatures that had chosen to trust her over the years, and she wondered what it was about her that made them feel safe. She did not sleep much that night, and the morning guards escorted her to the preparation area, and she was given protective clothing, though everyone knew it would do little against Krath spines, and she was offered a weapon which she refused. If I go in there armed, they'll see me as a threat, she explained, and that defeats the purpose. Zilfvar met her before she entered the arena. Last chance to withdraw, he said, and admit to using technology, and we'll commute your sentence. Sarah looked at him with tired eyes. I have nothing to admit, she said quietly. So let's get this over with. The arena door opened and Sarah walked through into the bright lights, and she heard the crowd in the observation deck go silent, and ahead of her she saw 6 Krath hatchlings being released from their containment units. They were beautiful in a deadly way, with sleek bodies covered in overlapping crystalline plates that refracted the light into rainbow patterns. And their spines stood erect in threat display, and their eyes were pure black and fixed on her. Sarah took a breath and stepped forward and began to hum the lullaby her grandmother had taught her so long ago. The 6 Krath hatchlings moved with the fluid precision of born killers, and their crystalline spines clicked against each other as they spread out to surround Sarah in a classic pack hunting formation in the observation deck. Commander Zilfar watched with his hand hovering over the emergency extraction control, and beside him the station's head xenobiologist was muttering calculations about how many seconds Sarah would survive once the hatchlings attacked. Sarah stood in the center of the arena and continued humming, and she knew that running would trigger their chase response, and that any sudden movement would be interpreted as either threat or prey behavior. So instead she knelt down. She slowly lowered herself until she was sitting on her heels with her hands resting gently on her thighs, and she made herself small and non-threatening and continued the soft melody that her grandmother had sung to her as a child. The hatchlings paused, and their black eyes fixed on this strange creature that was not fleeing and not attacking and not displaying any of the normal prey responses. They had been born knowing how to exploit. The largest hatchling took 3 steps closer, and its spines rattled in what Sarah recognized as a questioning sound rather than an aggressive one. She kept humming and kept her breathing slow, and even though her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat. Another hatchling approached from the side, and Sarah deliberately did not turn to look at it directly, because direct eye contact could be seen as a challenge, and instead, she kept her gaze soft and unfocused on the middle distance. The first hatchling reached her, and its head was level with her shoulder as it stretched its neck forward to sniff her hair, and Sarah felt the warmth of its breath and smelled something sharp like ozone. She wanted desperately to reach out and touch it, but she held still and let the hatchling investigate at its own pace. The creature circled around her and sniffed her back and her arms, and then it made a sound that Sarah had never heard described in any of the research papers she had read about Krath, and it was almost like a question. Sarah slowly extended her right hand with her palm facing down, and her fingers relaxed, and she held it at the level of the hatchling's chest and waited. The hatchling stared at her hand, and its spines began to lower gradually. And then it pushed its head underneath her palm. Sarah felt the cool, smooth surface of its crystalline plates, and very gently she moved her fingers in a soft stroking motion, and the hatchling's spines retracted completely in the observation deck. Someone gasped, and Zilfar heard the xenobiologist say something that his translator refused to render into standard language. The other 5 hatchlings watched this interaction and seemed to reach some kind of collective decision, because they all moved towards Sarah at once. She held her position and kept stroking the first hatchling, and when the others reached her, they pressed close, and she felt their weight against her legs and sides and back. One of the smaller hatchlings climbed partially into her lap and made a chirping sound, and Sarah used her left hand to stroke its head while continuing to pet the first hatchling with her right hand. The hatchlings settled around her, and their spines remained retracted, and they made soft clicking sounds that Sarah realized were contentment vocalizations. She continued humming, and the hatchlings began to hum back in a strange harmony, and their bodies vibrated with the sound. Time passed, and Sarah lost track of how long she sat there surrounded by creatures that should have killed her, and instead were treating her like she belonged to their pack. Finally, Commander Zilfvar's voice came through the arena speakers. "Dr. Okonkwo," he said, and his tone was carefully neutral. Can you stand and exit the arena? Sarah considered the question and slowly stopped humming. Hatchlings immediately looked up at her with what she could only interpret as concern. I don't think they want me to leave, she said, and her voice echoed in the large space. You need to exit so we can analyze what happened, Zilfvar, said Sarah, gently shifted her weight, and tried to stand, but the hatchlings pressed closer and made distressed sounds. If I try to leave them, they're going to get upset, Sarah warned, and upset. Krath or dangerous Krath. There was a long pause, and then Zilfvar spoke again. We're opening the south entrance, he said, and see if they'll follow you out. Sarah nodded and carefully extracted herself from the cluster of hatchlings and stood. Up slowly, the hatchling stood with her and pressed against her legs. She began walking toward the south entrance, and the hatchlings moved with her in perfect synchronization, and their formation shifted to keep her protected in the center. The door opened and Sarah walked through into a corridor, and the hatchlings followed, and their claws clicked on the metal floor. She was directed to a large holding area that had been hastily converted from a cargo bay, and when she entered, the hatchlings entered with her and immediately began exploring the space. While keeping her in sight, a team of xenobiologists and animal behaviorists watched through the transparent walls, and they recorded everything and made notes and argued in hushed voices. Thurin was among them, and the elderly scientist's many legs carried them closer to the transparent barrier, and their compound eyes studied Sarah with intense curiosity. Remarkable, Thurin said, and their translator rendered the word in standard language. Absolutely remarkable. Zilfvar arrived and stood beside Thurin and watched Sarah sit down against one wall while the hatchlings brought her objects they found interesting and dropped them in her lap like offerings. Is she using some form of telepathy? Zilfvar asked, or emitting chemicals we cannot detect? No, Thurin said definitively. We have monitored every possible form of communication, and there is nothing unusual. Then what is happening? Zilfvar demanded. Thurin was quiet for a moment, and their translator clicked softly as they formulated their thoughts. I have a theory, Thurin said finally, but I need to interview the Aro extensively, and I need to review what we know about human development patterns. Explain. Zilfvar said, not yet. Thurin replied, because I could be wrong, and if I'm right, then this changes everything we understand about human capabilities. Zilfvar felt frustration rise in his chest, but he trusted Thurin's judgment, and the scientist had been studying interspecies communication for longer than Zilfvar had been alive. How long do you need? He asked. 3 days, Thurin said. Maybe 4, and I need unrestricted access to Dr. Okonkwo, and I need her cooperation. She cooperate, Zilfvar said, because it's either that or spend the rest of her life in a research facility. Thurin turned their massive head to look at him directly. You would threaten her after she just survived an encounter that should have killed her? Thurin asked, and after she demonstrated an ability that no other species possesses? I'm trying to protect the station, Zilfvar said defensively, and protect the galaxy from whatever weapon or technology she might be hiding. She's not hiding anything, Thurin said with certainty. And she is not a threat, and she is something we have never encountered before, which is a human who can communicate across species barriers in ways we do not understand. Zilfvar looked back at Sarah, who was now surrounded by all 6 hatchlings, and one was asleep in her lap, while the others played some kind of game that involved gentle wrestling. She should be dead, he said quietly. Yes, Thurin agreed. She should be, and yet she sits there while the galaxy's most efficient killers treat her like family, and that is what we need to understand. Over the next 3 days, Sarah remained in the holding area with the hatchlings, and she was provided with food and water and basic amenities. And the hatchlings were fed separately, but refused to eat unless Sarah was present. Dr. Thurin interviewed her for hours each day and asked questions about her childhood and her experiences with animals and her methods of approaching unfamiliar species, Sarah answered honestly and tried to explain what she did, even though she was not entirely sure herself. It's about respect, she said during one session, and it's about recognizing that they have their own will and their own choices. And I'm not trying to dominate them or control them, and I'm just showing them that I'm safe. But how do you show them that? Thurin asked, and what signals are you sending? Sarah struggled to put it into words. It's body language, she said, and tone of voice and patience and maybe something else I don't have words for, and my grandmother called it reading the animal, but it's more like letting the animal read you. Thurin's translator hummed thoughtfully. Can you teach others to do this? They asked. Sarah considered the question. Maybe, she said, but it's not just a technique, and it's a way of thinking and a way of being present with another creature. On the fourth day, Thurin announced they were ready to present their findings to Commander Zilfvar and the station. Council Sarah was brought to a conference room, still accompanied by two of the hatchlings who refused to be separated from her, and they lay at her feet while Thurin began their presentation. I have determined the nature of Dr. Okonko's ability, Thurin announced, and it is not technology, and it is not manipulation, and it is something inherent to human psychology and development. Dr. Thurin activated the holographic display, and a complex diagram appeared showing developmental patterns of various species across the galaxy, and the conference room filled with council members and scientists and security personnel, all watching intently. To understand what Dr. Okonko can do, we must first understand how most species in the galaxy raise their young. Thurin began, and their translator converted their clicks and whistles into standard language. The display showed a Vicarian cub, and beside it was a detailed breakdown of its neural development. Vicarian cubs are born with genetic programming that tells them to follow specific pheromone signatures produced by their mothers, Thurin explained, and they do not choose their caregivers, and they imprint on whoever carries the correct chemical markers, and this is pure instinct. Display shifted to show a Krelian infant. Krelians follow a dominance hierarchy from birth, Thurin continued, and the young respond to displays of power and authority, and they learn their place in the social structure through a series of ritualized challenges, and again, this is genetically programmed behavior. The display cycled through a dozen more species, and each one showed young that followed rigid patterns of instinct and genetic programming. Across the galaxy, the pattern is consistent, Thurin said, and young predators, especially, follow biochemical signals or dominance, displays or territorial markers, and they do not make choices about who to trust, and they respond to predetermined triggers. Commander Zilfvar shifted in his seat and his tail curled with impatience. We know all of this, he said. So what makes humans different? Thurin's compound eyes glittered, and the display changed to show a human infant. Human children are born essentially helpless, Thurin said, and they require years of intensive care to reach even basic independence, and during this extended development period they do not follow pheromones or dominance displays. The display showed a human child's brain development over time. Instead, human children develop what I call trust-based bonding, Thurin explained, and they learn to evaluate potential caregivers based on complex social and emotional cues, and they make choices about who to trust. Sarah leaned forward in her seat, and one of the hatchlings at her feet made a soft questioning sound. Human infants watch faces, Thurin continued, and they interpret tone of voice and body language and emotional state, and they use this information to decide who is safe and who is dangerous. And this is not instinct in the traditional sense, and it is learned social intelligence, the display showed. A series of human facial expressions, and beside each one was data showing how infants responded. A human baby can look at a stranger and decide within moments whether that person is trustworthy, Thurin said, and they base this decision on subtle Cues that even the stranger might not be consciously aware they are. Projecting. Zilthvar began to understand where this was leading, and Dr. Okonkwo projects these cues. He asked. Precisely, Thurin said, and she has spent her entire life learning to read and respond to the emotional states of other creatures, and she learned this from her grandmother who learned it from her grandmother, and so on back through generations of humans who survived by forming bonds with animals. The display showed Sarah in the arena with the Krath hatchlings. When Dr. Okonkwo encountered the cubs on Kelvin Station, she unconsciously projected the same signals that a trustworthy human caregiver would project to a human child. Thurin explained, and patience, and calmness, and non-threatening body language, and genuine curiosity rather than fear or aggression. One of the council members spoke up, and a Threnari representative with 3 heads that conferred among themselves before speaking. The hatchlings are not human children, the Threnari said. So why would they respond to human social signals? Thorin's translator hummed with something that might have been satisfaction, because young predators across the galaxy have never encountered signals like this before, Thurin answered, and they are programmed to respond to specific triggers, but Dr. Okonkwo does not trigger any of their threat responses, and she does not trigger their prey responses, and she does not trigger their dominance responses. The display showed a complex behavioral flowchart to a young Krath hatchling doctor. Okonkwo reads as something entirely novel. Thurin continued, and not prey, because prey runs and shows fear and not threat, because threats are aggressive and display dominance, and not competing predator, because those show territorial behavior. Then what does she read as? Zilthvar, Thurin turned their massive body to face Sarah directly. She reads as choice, Thurin said simply, and for the first time in their lives, these young predators encounter a being that offers them the option to choose whether to attack or to trust, and most species never experience that choice, and they are told by their genetics what to do and who to follow and how to behave. The room was completely silent. Dr. Okonkwo does not command, Thurin continued, and she does not dominate, and she does not release any pheromones or biochemicals that force a response, and she simply presents herself as safe and then waits for the young creature to decide. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes, because this was exactly what her grandmother had always told her, and they choose to trust her. Thurin concluded, because she's the first being they have ever met, who treats them as individuals, capable of making their own decisions, rather than as biological automatons following genetic programming. The implications spread through the room like a shockwave. If this was true, then humans possessed an ability that no other known species had, and the ability to form trust-based bonds across species barriers and to communicate safety and respect through purely social and emotional channels. This is revolutionary. One scientist breathed, "This is dangerous." Another countered, "And what if humans can influence adult predators the same way?" "They cannot," Thurin said firmly. "And adult predators have already established their behavior patterns, and their responses are too ingrained to be overridden by social signals, and this only works with young creatures who are still learning and still capable of making choices about who to trust." Zilthvar stood and paced to the window, where he could see the station's docking ring. "If this information becomes public," he said slowly, "then every species in the galaxy will want to study humans, and some will see them as valuable resources, and others will see them as threats." "The information is already spreading," Thurin said, "and too many people witnessed. The experiment and word has traveled beyond this station." Sarah finally spoke up. "What does this mean for me?" she asked quietly. Marine approached her and laid one of their many legs gently on her shoulder. "It means you have given the galaxy a gift," they said. And you have shown us that there are other ways to communicate and other ways to form bonds beyond genetic programming and dominance hierarchies. It also means you're going to be in demand, Zilfvar added, and turned from the window. And every conservation program and xenobiology institute and diplomatic mission is going to want your help. Sarah looked down at the hatchlings sleeping at her feet. What happens to them? She asked. They have bonded with you, Thurin said, and separating them now would cause psychological trauma, and if you are willing, we would like you to keep them and continue to study this bond. Sarah stroked one of the hatchlings' heads, and it stirred in its sleep. I never wanted this, she said, and I just wanted to study predator behavior and publish my papers and teach. I know, Thurin said gently, but the galaxy has other plans for you now. The council debated for another 2 hours, and finally they reached a decision that our Sarah Okonkwo would be released from custody and cleared of all charges, and she would be offered a position as the head of a new research institute dedicated to studying cross-species communication and trust-based bonding. She would also be assigned a security detail, because there were already reports of extremist groups who saw humans as either a valuable resource to be exploited or a dangerous anomaly to be eliminated. Sarah accepted the position because she understood that she had no real choice and the knowledge was out, and she could either help shape how it was used or watch from the sidelines as others made decisions about her species' future. That night, she returned to her assigned quarters, which were much larger now and included a special habitat area. For the 2 hatchlings who had refused to leave her side, she sat on her bed and one hatchling curled up beside her while the other explored the room. Her datapad showed hundreds of messages from news agencies and research institutes and government officials and private citizens, and all of them wanted to know more about the human who could talk to predators. But Sarah ignored them all, and instead she opened a blank document and began writing a message to her grandmother's memory. You were right, she typed, and it was never about controlling them, and it was always about giving them the choice. And I wish you could see what that simple truth has done. She paused and looked at the hatchling beside her, and it gazed back with those black eyes. And she realized that everything was about to change. Not just for her, but for every human and every species in the galaxy. Because now they all knew that humans carried a gift that no one else possessed, and the ability to offer choice where before there had only been instinct. 3 months after Dr. Thurin's presentation, Sarah found herself aboard a diplomatic transport ship headed to the Frontier Conservation Summit, and beside her sat Commander Zilfvar, who had been reassigned as her security liaison, and around them were 6 Krath hatchlings who were now the size of adult dogs and growing larger every day. The revelation about human trust-based bonding abilities had spread through the galaxy faster than anyone anticipated, and the response had been mixed. Conservation groups hailed it as a breakthrough that could save dozens of endangered predator species, and xenobiologists requested funding for new research programs, and some governments proposed exchange programs where humans could help rehabilitate aggressive species. But there was a darker response to extremist groups from species who valued genetic purity and rigid social hierarchies condemned humans as corrupting influences who undermine natural order, and there were protests at human embassies and calls for restrictions on human travel. Some criminal organizations saw opportunity and attempted to kidnap humans to use in illegal wildlife trafficking operations or to create private armies of bonded predators. Sarah's transport had already evaded 2 intercept attempts, and the ship's captain had rerouted 3 times to avoid suspicious vessels. You should have stayed on Earth, Zilfvar said for perhaps the 20th time, and let someone else speak for humanity. At this summit? Sarah replied, and let them decide our future without our input. One of the hatchlings made a rumbling sound and pressed against her leg. The transport shuddered suddenly, and alarms began blaring. We're under attack, the captain's voice announced through the speakers, an unknown vessel firing on our engines, and prepare for emergency maneuvers. Sarah grabbed a support rail as the ship lurched, and the hatchlings spread out around her in a protective formation and their spines. Extended Zilfvar was already on his communicator coordinating with the ship's security team. "We have hostile boarders," he said, and looked at Sarah. "And you need to get to the safe room now. I'm not hiding while people die protecting me." Sarah said, "This is not a debate." Zilfvar snapped, but before Sarah could respond, the corridor door exploded inward and 3 armored figures rushed through, and their weapons were raised. The hatchlings reacted instantly, and they moved as a coordinated unit and struck with devastating precision, and their crystalline spines punched through armor and their claws found weak points. And within seconds, all 3 attackers were down. More attackers poured through the breach, and the hatchlings met them head-on. Sarah watched in horror as the creatures, who slept curled around her at night, transformed into the deadly predators they were born to be. And yet, even in combat, they maintained a protective perimeter around her. Zilfvar fired his weapon at an attacker who had gotten past the hatchlings and pulled Sarah toward a side corridor. "We need to reach the escape pods," he shouted. Over the sounds of combat, they ran through the ship, and behind them, Sarah could hear the hatchlings following and the sounds of pursuit. They reached the pod bay, and Zilfvar began the launch sequence, but a massive shape blocked the doorway. It was a Vicarian adult, and not just any Vicarian, but one whose facial markings Sarah recognized from the biodome incident 3 months ago. It was the mother of the 3 cubs. The hatchlings positioned themselves between Sarah and the newcomer, and their spines rattled aggressively, but the adult Vicarian made a sound and a complex series of clicks and growls that Sarah's translator struggled to render. "Stand down," Zilfvar said, "and read his own translator, as she says she's not here to attack." The Vicarian mother approached slowly, and her eyes fixed on Sarah, and she spoke again. "You protected my cubs," the translator rendered, "and you showed them kindness when others would have killed them, and I have tracked you across space to repay that debt. We didn't ask for your help," Zilfvar said, "and yet you need it." The Vicarian replied and gestured behind her, where more of her species emerged from the shadows. "And my pack has dealt with the attackers, and your ship is secure." Sarah stepped forward, and the hatchlings parted to let her pass. "Thank you," she said simply. The Vicarian lowered her massive head in what Sarah recognized as a gesture of respect. "My cubs have not forgotten you," the Vicarian said, "and they speak of the kind human who gave them choice and who taught them that not all strangers are threats." Behind the Vicarians, Sarah saw something else moving, and her breath caught it. It was a pack of adult Krathi. Should not have been there, and Krath did not travel on ships and did not form alliances with other species, and yet here they were, and their black eyes fixed on Sarah with unmistakable recognition. "They followed our ship." The captain's voice came through the speakers, and shock evident in his tone. "And they've been trailing us for 2 days, and we thought they were another threat, but they just saved us from a second wave of attackers." Sarah walked toward the Krath, and Zilfvar tried to grab her arm, but she pulled away. The adult Krath were 3 times the size of the hatchlings, and their crystalline spines could tear through hull plating, and they had killed thousands across dozens of star systems. But as Sarah approached, they lowered their heads and retracted their spines. The largest one made a sound in a complex harmonic that Sarah felt in her chest. "These are the parents." Dr. Tharine's voice came through Sarah's communicator, and the scientist had been monitoring from the station. "And the parents of the hatchlings you bonded with. And Krath never abandoned their young, but those hatchlings chose you. And so the pack has chosen to protect what their children value." Sarah reached out and touched the largest Krath's crystalline plates, and they were warm under her hand. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. The Krath made another sound, and Sarah's translator rendered it as choice. She understood then. Just as the young creatures chose to trust her, the adult creatures had chosen to protect her, and not because of instinct or genetic programming, but because their children had shown them that this human was worth protecting. The remaining journey to the Frontier Conservation Summit proceeded without incident, and when Sarah's ship docked at the massive station, she emerged, accompanied by 6 Krath hatchlings and their parents and a pack of Vecarians and Commander Zilfar. Assembled delegates from hundreds of species. Watched in stunned silence. Sarah was scheduled to address the summit on the final day, and she spent the time before meeting with conservationists and xenobiologists and government representatives, and all of them wanted to understand what humans could do and how they could use this ability. Some wanted humans to help with endangered species programs. Others wanted to establish diplomatic protocols for human-alien animal interactions. A few wanted to ban humans from certain regions. Entirely on the morning of her address, Sarah stood in her quarters and looked at her reflection, and she wore simple clothes and no decoration because she wanted to be seen as herself and not as some kind of miracle worker. The hatchling sensed her nervousness and pressed close. "We're going to tell them the truth," she said to them, "and we're going to explain that this isn't about control or manipulation, and it's about respect and choice." The conference hall was enormous and could hold 10,000 beings, and every seat was filled. Sarah walked to the central platform, and the Krath and Vicarians took positions around the perimeter, and their presence sent a clear message. She began to speak. "3 months ago, I was detained for a crime I didn't commit," she said, and her voice carried through the hall. "And I was accused of using technology to manipulate predatory species, and the truth is much simpler and much more profound." She paused and gathered her thoughts. "Humans don't control these creatures," she continued, "and we don't manipulate them, and we don't force them to follow us, and what we do is offer them something most species have never experienced, which is choice." The hall remained silent. "Choice in who to trust," Sarah said, "and choice in who to follow, and choice in who to protect. And my grandmother taught me that you can't make an animal trust you, and you can only show them that you're safe, and then they decide for themselves." She gestured to the creatures surrounding her. "These beings chose to trust me," she said, "and I didn't ask them to, and I didn't demand it, and I simply showed them through my actions and my intentions that I respect them as individuals and that I recognize their right to make their own decisions." A delegate from a hierarchical species stood. "This undermines the natural order," they declared, "and young creatures should follow their genetic programming and not make choices based on emotional manipulation from aliens." Sarah felt anger rise but kept her voice calm. "Is it manipulation to treat another being with kindness?" she asked. "And is it wrong to give a young creature the option to trust rather than forcing them into predetermined patterns?" She looked around the hall. For millions of years, species across this galaxy have relied on instinct and genetic programming and dominance. "Hierarchies," she said. "And those systems work, but they also limit. And they prevent the kind of cross-species understanding that we're capable of." She placed her hand on the nearest hatchling's head. "These Krath hatchlings chose me," she said. "And their parents chose to protect me, and not because I controlled them, but because I showed them that humans understand something fundamental about consciousness and about free will and about the importance of choice." Another delegate spoke up. "What prevents humans from using this ability for warfare?" they asked. "And what stops you from creating armies of bonded predators?" "The same thing that stops us from doing any number of terrible things we're capable of," Sarah replied. "And our ethics, and our laws, and our recognition that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should." She took a breath. "I'm not here to convince you that humans are perfect," she said. "And I'm not here to claim that we should be allowed unrestricted access to every species and every planet. And what I'm asking is that you see this ability for what it is, which is a different way of communicating and a different way of forming relationships." The debate continued for hours, and Sarah answered questions and addressed concerns, and slowly she saw opinions beginning to shift. Finally, The summit chairman called for a vote on the proposal that had been drafted, which was the choice protocol. It would establish guidelines for human interaction with alien species and create research programs to study trust-based bonding and set up conservation initiatives where humans could help endangered predators. Would also protect humans from exploitation and guarantee their rights to refuse participation in programs they disagreed with. The vote passed with 70% approval as Sarah left the conference hall exhausted but satisfied. The craft parents approached her. The largest one made a sound, and Sarah's translator rendered it. "You gave our children something we could never give them," it said. "And you gave them the knowledge that the world is bigger than instinct, and that choice exists." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. "They gave me something too," she said, "and they showed me that trust can cross any barrier when it's offered freely."